So I just got back from watching Doctor Strange, and I think it's okay. It's not the best Marvel film by far, but it isn't the worst Marvel film ever, as it does have a lot of similar elements that make a Marvel movie, but it also has elements that make it unique. And that's kind of a thing with Marvel movies nowadays, is that each incarnation of a Marvel film has their own unique spin. Ant-Man has its own feel, Guardians of the Galaxy had its own feel, The Winter Soldier had its own feel, and now we're getting Doctor Strange, which goes into a new area of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the multiverse, as well as mystical elements, and I have to say that that works for the film's enjoyment. Now, to say that Marvel films are kind of growing old is a bit overstated, but I can see the reasons why, because every time we get an origin movie, it's always the same thing. You get a guy who is outside of the norm, and he gets introduced into a new world that he's never noticed before, and then he has to fight some big bad guy, and that's pretty much the staleness of the whole formula itself for origin stories, and it's kind of getting old. And you would think that by now Marvel would be switching up their game and doing something new with the piece. However, I guess with Marvel, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And unfortunately, it works to its negative in this case, because again, I really want to get enveloped in Doctor Strange's world, and for the most part it did. It had interesting characters, interesting subplots. I wish it would go a little bit more in depth with some of the training that goes on with Doctor Strange, as that entire sequence of events that lead to certain events afterwards really feel clunky. They don't necessarily jive well with the film, but it does lead it to be fairly enjoyable. I did find myself actually enjoying this film quite a lot, even though it's not the best Marvel film. It has some good comedy, although at times it can ruin the pacing. There are certain scenes where you're supposed to feel something for a particular character, but then at the same time, afterwards, it gets into this comedy routine, and it kind of feels like the tone is a bit jumbled towards the end, especially the end of the film. It kind of gets jumbled. And the final boss of this film is kind of reminiscent to like, oh, well, this is kind of like the big bad guy. Oh, he looks like a giant version of that thing from Green Lantern. But the way they kind of dispatch with the villain isn't necessarily beating the crap out of him. More so, it was rather kind of like Groundhog's Day or Edge of Tomorrow levels of ridiculousness. It was actually kind of hilarious just watching the ending. It's all worth the price of admission. And the best part about this film, by far, is its visual quality. Never have I seen a movie so weird, so mysteriously odd, that's really great. You know, visually, it's a perfect thing for this type of universe to really bring into focus. I would actually say that if you want to have an enjoyable time while also watching it in IMAX 3D, I would actually suggest this movie. But if you were looking for something else, I don't know what to say to you. If you're not a big fan of Marvel movies by now, you're probably not going to be a Marvel fan and in this one. However, I would recommend that you go see this film just because of its visual atmosphere and Benedict Cumberbatch's charisma. And let's talk about Benedict Cumberbatch's character as a whole. He is a perfect representation of a lot of things that we should aspire to be. A person who is willing to go above and beyond the call of duty to try to figure out problems for himself or herself, you know, trying to do the best they can with what they got, or at least to try to make it better by improving themselves. That is something that needs to be commended. And that is also something that I also strive for in my life. Whenever something goes wrong, I try to improve upon it and make it much better. And Dr. Stephen Strange is a perfect embodiment of that message, and I think it's a perfect message for kids. Even though he is a bit of a sarcastic asshole, you could still kind of, you know, cope with him because, well, he's Doctor Strange. I mean, if we have characters that are the same as Doctor Strange, like Iron Man or Ant-Man being sarcastic people, then we can assume that every freaking character is sarcastic and we could all attach to him. I don't even know what I'm talking about at this point, but I would seriously recommend watching Doctor Strange. It's not the best movie, but you will get your money's worth by far, whether it be from the visual aspects or from some of the story plots and characters. So I'm giving this film a solid 7 out of 10. So I just got back from seeing Trolls, the new DreamWorks animated picture film, and it kind of falls in the same line as I feel with the movie Home, where it's kind of good, but it has a lot of bad qualities to it that ultimately make it ultimately forgettable. And it's kind of sad, really, because I really love DreamWorks animation. I love The Prince of Egypt. I love some of the Shrek movies. I love the How to Train Your Dragon films. I love the Kung Fu Panda films, even though the third one wasn't as strong as the second movie. But now we're getting into territory that, honestly, I don't see why they needed to go in this direction. So what's Trolls about anyway? Well, Trolls is essentially the Smurfs. If you know the Smurf story, then you kind of know what this movie's going to be about, with a few added bits and pieces here and there. Just imagine Gargamel as a fucking chef who snatches the Smurfs to feed to a bunch of his mates from college. I don't know. But that's pretty much Trolls in a nutshell, and it's unfortunate because DreamWorks is better known for making deep, emotional films. And that's not to say that this film doesn't have emotional connections. It does have some emotional connections towards the very end of the film. But towards the beginning of the film, it just feels a bit too overly positive. And that's, granted, that's not really a valid criticism at all, because a lot of people will basically poke a hole in that argument and say, well, nothing's ever too overly positive. Nothing's ever too this. And I kind of agree, but for me personally, I just found it a bit too over-positive for me, and it doesn't really necessarily break the film in any sort of way. But unfortunately, this film suffers from a lot of other problems with modern contemporary animated films, in which they have random musical numbers that make no sense to the world whatsoever. This film was annoying. It was annoying to see random scenes get a musical treatment for no reason. If this was marketed as a musical, I could understand it. But the fact that it's just kind of, oh, well, we're just an animated film and we're going to have fun. And, I don't want to say it's as bad as Strange Magic, but the music doesn't make any sense to the world at all. It just doesn't. If it was all original songs, I could understand it. But these are songs that have been recorded before and were released way before this film came out. So it makes no sense for the world itself inside of the film to be using these songs that these characters don't know. And that's, again, a problem with the animated industry at this point. If you look at the Lego movie, they didn't put in like Beyonce or anything. No, they made a song. The Lonely Island made a song that was incorporated into the main world, and it worked. But when you look at this and you use songs from artists that had been released way before this movie came out and makes no sense to the world whatsoever, it breaks every sort of sense of immersion, and that's kind of what was wrong with the Trolls for me. It wasn't very immersive. However, saying that, the music was handled very well, I have to say. Seeing how Justin Timberlake was the music producer on this film, you would stand to notice that the film itself actually has some good music. And it does have good music, it just doesn't make sense for the world. And that's kind of a plus. The music's good, doesn't really immerse me. Another thing I found actually pretty good is the voice acting. The voice acting is great, for the most part. And the art design and the way the animation goes is actually pretty well handled as well. Would I recommend this film? No, but if you're kind of at a dry point and you don't want to watch like Hacksaw Ridge or Doctor Strange or anything, good, I'd say go watch this movie. But I'd officially give Trolls a 5 out of 10. Hacksaw Ridge sees the return of director Mel Gibson and stars Andrew Garfield as a protagonist who, during World War II, saved 75 men during the Battle of Okinawa in one night without using a single bullet. This film is spectacular. It is one of those films that, to me, made my jaw drop at just the pure amount of violent pornography that's in this film. The amount... there are some critics out there who are saying that this is an overglorification of violence, but however, I think he captured war very uniquely and very realistically, because there's no real way to really portray war other than to show its pure violent nature and tendencies. And that's what this film did in its second half. The first act of the film is more about setting up the characters that we are coming to know and love towards the second half of the film, where some of them will die and some of them will be maimed and tortured and some of them will make it out alive. It's just one of those films that allows you to think about certain characters and what your attachment to such characters are. It's such a great way to tell this type of story, and Mel Gibson certainly knows how to direct this type of story. Now, this has been 10 years since Mel Gibson has been behind the camera, and it really doesn't show here. He does know how to really set the cameras up. He knows which parts to show, which parts not to show, and he knows how to show war in its most bloodiest. And I say bloodiest in the greatest of terms because it does get violent. It does get bloody. And it's unrelenting. And a perfect example of this is the audience reaction I saw in the theater. I was sitting next to an old woman inside of the theater, and when the shit hit the fan, literally, she freaked out. She could not stand sitting in her seat because it was so violent, so realistic, that she nearly wanted to leave the entire theater. That's how effective this film is. And it's pulled together by really strong performances out of every single actor that's put on screen, including Hugo Weaving and Vince Vaughn, which, for actors being cheesy as they are, I never thought for once in my life that they would ever give a grand performance, but it turns out that both of them can pull out pretty effective performances. And Andrew Garfield is pretty much the emotional through line that the audience is supposed to feel with. This is his character is about moral conviction, standing up for what you believe in. And it's pretty much a basic sort of story about, oh, well, I gotta stand up for my convictions, I gotta stand up for what I believe in, and that's pretty fine and dandy, but what really enhances it is how Andrew Garfield portrays the character. And this is honestly one of his best performances of his career. I mean it. And as a person who didn't like the Amazing Spider-Man that much, he certainly has improved in a lot of areas, and that goes for the same thing as Vince Vaughn and Hugo Weaving. In fact, every single actor in this film gives a performance of their life, and it's hugely amazing to see on screen. The best parts about this film is when it tells a story effectively, when it shows what it needs to show, and when it doesn't show what it doesn't need to show, and that's what it does. And it's great. It's a great movie all around, and I really got to compliment especially the sound design of this film. The sound design for this film is spectacular. There are moments where the music will drop, and you're sitting there watching people trying to crawl through the trenches of Okinawa, and there will be a sudden, sharp gunfire blast that sounds realistic. It's like they actually took real guns and recorded it, kind of like how they would do in the video game industry with guns themselves. You know, they would record the sounds of the guns and then mix them in together with the actions of the gun. But it sounds crystal clear. It does sound like it is a real gunfire shot. Having been a person who has actually used a firearm before, it does actually sound like a real gun. It's a great sound design altogether. The tension of this film is tremendous, especially when you see Andrew Garfield's character trying to save all these other soldiers on the Hacksaw Ridge. It's one of those things where it's like, there's not a lot of music, but you can tell by the way the mise-en-scène is, the way the camera moves, the way, the scene is set up, that tension is pretty much throughout the entire film, because we do want to see Andrew Garfield's character get out alive. We want to see him succeed in what he wants to do. And the tension in the second half of the entire film is huge. I almost had a heart attack from watching this film because the tension was so high. Would I say that this is the best Mel Gibson film? No. It's probably the second best film behind Braveheart, but is it worthy of an Oscar nomination? I seem to think so. At least maybe a Best Supporting Actor for Hugo Weaving or Vince Vaughn. I think Hugo Weaving would probably get the nomination over Vince Vaughn. Maybe the sound design, and possibly Best Picture. I don't know. Maybe best original screenplay. Maybe, I don't know, or adapted screenplay. I don't know. We'll see. But in terms of the film itself, I actually would go to stand to reason that this is one of the best films of the entire year. In a world that we are lacking true authenticity with some of our films, this one seems a bit more, far more authentic than anything else I've seen this year. And for that, I'm giving this film a 10 out of 10.